So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, which is the next in Epigeum's Thought Leadership series. Today, we're going to be discussing student wellbeing in Australia. We do have a few more people joining, but in the meantime, it's time to start, so let's go. Next slide, please. So my name's Lucy, and I am the Academic Partnerships Manager for Epigeum. I'll be facilitating today's webinar along with my colleague Sumitra, who's doing tech support behind the scenes. Before we continue, I want to acknowledge that I am speaking to you today from the lands of the Kaurna people. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which our webinar attendees and speakers all work, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this meeting, and the First Nations people across New Zealand if they are also participating. I pay my respects to elders, past, present, and emerging. Epigeum, part of Sage Publishing, is a leading provider of online training courses supporting the needs of higher education institutions in three core areas: research, support and wellbeing, and studying. Today we're focusing on our support and wellbeing strand. Next slide, please. I'm very pleased to welcome our prestigious expert speakers, Dr. Gareth Furber and Sanjoli Banerjee, both of whom have a wealth of knowledge within this field. I'm delighted to have both of them here with us today, presenting on such a crucial topic for us all in the higher education community. Next slide, please. We'll hear from both our guests shortly, but first, a quick housekeeping message. We have a Q&A box and chat function, so please write any questions throughout for our speakers, and we will try to answer those towards the latter part of our session. This webinar is also being recorded today, and we will share the recording shortly after the event. So now the housekeeping is complete, I'd like to invite our first guest speaker, Sanjoli Banerjee. Sanjoli is an international securities studies graduate from ANU, and she also recently completed a Master of Social Work from the University of Wollongong, Australia. She wears many hats. She's an activist championing the causes of gender and education in India, a leader who runs her own NGO in India, working at the grassroots level with communities, engaging with over 500 youth. And she's also an advocate for international students in Australia, having held various leadership roles on committees and student bodies. Her change-making work has been endorsed by King Charles's government, by Diana Award, UNDP, UN Women, and various other platforms. Over to you, Sanjoli.
Thank you very much, Lucy. It's a pleasure to be here and to be sharing this panel with Dr. Gareth. And thank you, everyone, for joining in today. So we will be talking about student mental health, and I am no expert in this, but I just share what my lived experience has been. Next slide, please. Thank you. So before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the country that I live on, the beautiful country of Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, also called Canberra, the capital city of Australia. I am extremely privileged to have lived on this land, to have gained some wonderful knowledge, and have attended university here. Next slide, please. Awesome. So I think the first natural question that comes to our minds is, why am I here? Well, it's thanks to Epigeum that they gave me this opportunity to be here. But today I would be utilizing my personal lived experience of having been a student across two countries outside my home country. I've studied in Australia for about 5 years. I also studied in the UK at University of Sheffield for a semester. And I have studied social work formally, taken formal education in that, and that's where I studied about mental health extensively. I have also worked in certain roles with students at the university, engaged in social work placements, in community, and in leadership roles. And I shall be utilizing all these experiences to talk about student mental health today. Next slide, please. Awesome. So I think the first thing before we really jump into the topic is to dissect the term student, what student really means, because we're talking about student mental health today, and I think it's a very generic term. It's a very vast term, and it would be an injustice if we talked about or referred to anyone as just a student, because I prefer taking in an intersectional approach. So the question that arises is which student. So there are lots of factors that come into play when we talk about students. They are nationality, especially because I am speaking from Australia. So Australia happens to be one of the top destinations for international students. So I think nationality plays a vital role when we're talking about students. There's language proficiency, there's financial status, gender, religion, sexuality, level of education, family, if they're parents, if they have kids, and they are a student. So all of these factors really shape the status or the place of a student in the entire spectrum. And that then ties to the factor that we need to identify that certain groups of students might be more marginalized than others. And therefore, we need to recognize that students, as such, might have unique needs, goals, and aspirations, and there might be a risk of homogenization when we talk about students as an umbrella term. Next slide, please. The second term, the vital term that we're talking about today, is mental health. And as I said, I'm no expert, but from my understanding of mental health, I think, and what my social work professors might be proud to hear, is that we need to take a more biopsychosocial approach rather than a biomedical approach towards mental health. And without going too much into this, I think biopsychosocial model is just a more holistic approach towards mental health that considers not mental health not just as a disease, something that's classified as an illness as per Western science, and it's not an illness that needs to be treated with medicines, but rather a more holistic approach which considers social factors and society and role of family and everything else in shaping mental health. And therefore, I advocate for a more human rights and social justice lens when we talk about mental health. Next slide, please. So, where is the problem? Well, I don't want to sound a very deficit based here. I definitely am a fan of strengths based approach, but I think when we're talking about a scenario, and in order to do better, we need to identify the problem. And being a typical social work student, I realized that there was problem at three different levels. So I'm going to break it down into micro, macro, and meso level. At the micro level, I think it's the positionality, as I mentioned earlier, the positionality of a student in the society. Where are they positioned? And that defines their level of privilege or marginalization, which affects the student's mental health. But from the service provider's point of view, I think somewhere what I have realized or observed in my few years of experience is that there's a lack of genuine curiosity or active and deep listening. And when we're talking about mental health, I think as a therapist or as a mental health professional or as a social worker, I think this is something that's critical. Rather, I understand that there's a power dynamic, involved when a student is seeking mental health support. But breaking that down and practicing genuine curiosity can really help the student open up and feel respected. At the organizational level, I think there's a general lack of meaningful, culturally sensitive practice, and there aren't many multicultural staff, and there isn't a very conducive environment for seeking support for students. And this I say because a lot of times students hesitate to seek help at the university or outside university if they don't see faces that are familiar to themselves, or they don't feel that they might be understood. And therefore, we need a more culturally sensitive practice. And definitely, no one can be, a master of culturally sensitive practice. It's always a journey. It's a work in progress, and that ties to my previous point on genuine curiosity. So it doesn't have to be that if you're working with students, we need to know everything. It's not that situation. It's actually just being genuinely curious, be practicing humility, and just being led by the student. And at the systemic level, I think there's a larger failure to recognize the interplay of international factors that impact a student's mental health. So it's not just the local factors, it's because a lot of times tertiary education, I think institutions tend to be very focused on what universities can do, what the government can do, but we somewhere fail to recognize that there are larger factors as well that impact in a student's mental health. And herein, I'd like to quickly share an anecdote from my own experience. So I happened to work with a student from PNG, Papua New Guinea, and she's an international student from there. She's a parent herself, and she happens to belong to the indigenous community of PNG. And she had been facing mental health conditions, and she was seeking help from the support and well-being unit with whom I was also working. And so what had happened was an ethnic war had broken out in her community back in PNG, and her children were abducted and they were assaulted. Her parents were alone at home at the risk of their lives, and she simply couldn't focus on her exams, on her academics, and she was on the verge of failing her courses. She was also the first woman in the PNG military, and her family was known to be, the peacekeepers in the community in cases of communal violence. So she wore many hats, and that's where I bring in positionality and intersectionality. So when we are working with a student like that, we need to understand where the stress is coming from. It's not just the local stress, it's not just academic based, it's not limited to the university, but it's actually coming from something that's outside, the local structure, from outside the micro and the mesostructure. And just and similar case was when I was working from a student with a student from Pakistan, whose father had lost his business in the floods that Pakistan faced some time back, and his father was the only person who was funding his education here. And because they'd faced a major financial loss, he wasn't able to pay the fees, and the student, because of the stress, failed all his subjects and was at the risk of basically leaving the university. And such cases, basically depict that there are larger factors at play. And as mental health workers, as people in that support system, we need to recognize those, and we need to update our knowledge. We need to understand and recognize these factors, and basically also be more prepared and have a better understanding of how these impact the students' mental health. Um, and I had recently written an article about international students and their mental health, and I'd mentioned, and I quote here, that students should not just be seen merely as a source of income, but as humans with certain rights. And I think that perception is important when we work with students, when we work with international students especially. Next slide, please. So, what a poor mental health among students looks like is basically it manifests itself as poor overall well-being for students, deterioration in academic performance, higher fail rates, students experience being negatively impacted, a reduced ability to engage in full capacity with university life, financial crisis, and risk of withdrawal from university. So these are certain things that basically signify poor mental health, and these are all interconnected. Basically, yeah. Next slide, please. So, not taking too long, I think I'd like to talk about what we can do about it. And I'd like not to paint a very grim picture, because there's a lot that can be done. And I'd like to take that approach. And in my experience, this is my opinion that these five things can help us support students better. taking an intersectional approach, as I already mentioned, understanding the various factors that might be marginalizing a student, and not just approaching them as a student but as a human, and that might really help. Second is taking a systems theory, so recognizing where the system is oppressing students. Is this system and the larger institutions, the policy, supporting students and their well-being, or is it marginalizing them? And therein comes the role of activism and advocacy as universities, as staff in the universities. How can we better support students? Is it a change in policy that we need? Is it a change in the implementation of the policy that we need? So taking a larger systems theory approach. The third way is dialogical praxis, and that it refers to basically a two-way approach rather than a one-way approach. So deconstructing mental health together in partnership with the student. Instead of seeing student as a receiver, as a recipient of mental health service, or instead of taking mental health professional as the knower or the knowledge holder of all knowledge, rather than that, deconstructing that practice and making it a two-way approach. Fourth is decolonizing mental health knowledge and promoting cultural practices, and this is particularly relevant for the culturally and linguistically diverse communities that we have in Australia, in the UK, across globe, and also the indigenous communities that we have in Australia, who are particularly marginalized. So when we're working with people from different cultures, so rather than taking a Western perspective and a Western approach on mental health, promoting cultural practices. So for instance, I come from India, and in India, we approach mental health as something related to spirituality, as something that can be healed through spiritual practices, through yoga, through meditation, through community support. And because India happens to be a very communitarian, a very collective society, so that's where an entire village comes together to kind of support a person who's going through a mental health condition. So understanding that different cultures have different kind of approaches towards healing, towards recovery, and similarly, indigenous ways of knowing, being, doing are unique in themselves as well. So that approach can really be a strengths-based approach when working with students. And finally, I think there's a need for greater awareness for among students. I have observed generally that students are not very well aware of the services, of the resources available to them, whether it's available by the government or the university has made those available, but it doesn't always reach the students. So in that case, better marketing of the services that are available, identifying where the barriers are, where the gaps are, why is it not reaching students, how can it reach them, and also taking a two-pronged approach. So basically, a top-down and a bottom-up approach, wherein not just the policymakers or the management sit together and make policies, but also the other way up. So bottom up, students coming together, considering students as partners, wherein we understand what their needs are, what their aspirations are, and together with them, we create policies and we create systems and better support systems um, that can really help kind of supporting their mental health better. And finally, I think taking a collaborative and an interdisciplinary approach. And when I say that, I mean I've generally observed that universities work in silos when they work with students. So I rather suggest that community and student associations and faculties and university staff and the larger policy makers, they all come together to work and support students instead of working in silos. So student associations can be a great resource to rope in to understand how the students are feeling, and thus that collaborative approach can really help kind of reach students better. So these are certain kind of ideas that I bring from my experience. And finally, I'd like to end my talk with a powerful quote that I learned in social work. Next slide, please. and which goes nothing about us without us, and it comes from the consumer movement, but I think it was quite relevant here as well when we're talking about student well-being and student mental health, that when we're making policies, when we're talking about supporting students, we should be roping in students as well. We should be considering them as part of this discussion, as part of the policy making process, and kind of having them and walking hands in hands with students at every level of policy making and execution, so that we make more meaningful policies for students. So, yes, that's all. Thank you very much. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, Sanjoli. That was fantastic. Really interesting insights there. Thank you so much. And to everybody in the webinar, please don't forget to drop any questions for Sanjoli and Gareth in the chat, in the Q&A box. I have a few questions, but we'd love to get your questions too. So we're now going to hear from Dr. Gareth Furber. Gareth's a psychologist at Flinders University, South Australia, and he focuses on mental health promotion. He writes, teaches, and delivers programs on mental health, self-care, productivity, and healthy habits, aiming to equip students and staff with essential mental health care skills and resources. Over to you, Gareth.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Lucy. Thank you, Epigeum, for the invitation, and thank you, Sanjoli, for a fantastic lead-in presentation. You covered a number of topics there, which I know are definitely going to be part of my further development and understanding in this area. So, look, good morning, afternoon or evening, depending on wherever you may be joining us. My name's Gareth. I am, like Lucy, broadcasting from Ghana land. I'd like to express my gratitude for the fact that I do get to live and work and play on this land, and understanding and being able to action more around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspectives on mental health and wellbeing is a key growth area for me, which I'll talk about in a tick. As to who I am, I'm a psychologist by trade. I trained at Flinders, went and worked for 10 years in child and adolescent mental health, working in research and projects. And then a chance presented itself in 2016 to shift gears a little, to come back to Flinders. I took that chance, and I'm very glad I did. I've been at Flinders now since 2017. I'm called the E-Mental Health Project Officer. If you pass that out, the E refers to the fact that there's a bias, a digital bias in what it is that I do, intended that I'd be able to use digital channels through which to communicate. Mental health refers to the outcome, what we're actually looking to improve in the people that connect with our initiatives. And project officer, to a certain extent, is permission for me to try a lot of things. And that's definitely how the role is played out, and how I'll give you a sort of bit of a sense of that. So I start with the question of whether we have a problem with mental health when it comes to students. I currently sit in the probably category. So look, even if we assume that university is a neutral or even a positive force for mental health, a large number of our cohort sit in the most vulnerable age range, at least as far as Australian statistics go, the most vulnerable age range for mental illness. And this data is really just looking at common mental disorders and predictions of the number of people who meet criteria over a 12-month period. The numbers are likely to be higher once we take all of the conditions into account. And you can see our age range here at the higher level of how mental illness presents across the lifespan. And so many of our cohort, many of the university cohort, are going to be struggling, not necessarily per se because of the university, but simply because of developmental and other factors and broader cultural drivers that are going on in their life. Does that mean that university is a net positive force for mental health? At this stage, it appears not, but I think maybe how we're analysing this plays a role in it. This is some data from a 2014 Australian study by Larkham et al. Suggested that levels of depression, anxiety, and stress are higher in the student population than they are in kind of a matched general population. I've seen this pattern pop up a number of times over the years. Origin, who are one of the leading, if not the leading, youth mental health organisation in Australia, said in their Under the Radar report, which was their report on university students, they said, It is also possible that the very nature of the university experience could increase the risk of psychological distress among this population. So we've got an age effect occurring here as well, and then it appears as though we add additional on top of that in terms of the university experience. And in case that didn't depress you enough, there's a bit more to the picture as well. It's not just the stress that we're talking about here. It's not just the stress that we're interested in when we're talking about mental health. We're interested in whether students are experiencing the positive aspects of mental health, feeling competent, feeling connected, feeling as though they belong, a sense of satisfaction, the experience of pleasure. And this data, which comes from a cohort of Flinders students, shows that there are many students up here, if we took a look at overall wellbeing, for whom we could be doing better in terms of creating these positive experiences. And so in short, I think it's very appropriate that we're asking and continuing to ask the question about how to support students' mental health. So I do want to clarify at least how I understand the concept of mental health, and I loved Sanjoli's presentation, picking up on some other aspects here. So I'll definitely, with her permission, take some of that content as well. But my role is mental health specific, but I will make some mention of the terms wellbeing and resilience as I go, as these are also commonly used in the same context in which we're talking about the experiences of students. So look, I trained to view mental health in categorical terms. I was trained to diagnose and treat mental illnesses, and there's plenty of them. This is the list. There'll be a test at the end of the session as if you remembered them all. From a student support perspective, this would really be around campaigning to increase awareness and understanding of mental illness, and then providing appropriate treatments, or at least links to treatments for students who are suffering. And so we know from the numbers that we're looking at before that this could constitute a significant number of students on its own. But the diagnosis approach, whilst it has many benefits, limits the focus to those with illness. And mental health is something that everyone has, and we want everyone in that conversation. And so what we see, and certainly what happened in my understanding and what we see more broadly, is that we start thinking about mental health as a continuum. This is what a continuum-based approach might look like when we're considering mental health as a whole. But you could take any domain of mental health or particular symptom cluster and see that it exists along a continuum, it's distributed along a continuum. This allows us to consider where we might be with our mental health at any given moment. So I look at the category, where do I sit from that doing really well end to the struggling end? It highlights that there are significant struggle states that aren't diagnosed illness. That's really important. We don't want people, just because a person doesn't meet criteria for an illness, we don't want that to mean that they don't get access to the treatments and supports they require. But it also highlights the positive end of the spectrum as well. And interestingly, if you look at somewhere like the World Health Organization, their definition of mental health takes that positive end approach. It talks about what is present in a person's life rather than what they are struggling with per se. So do I have well-being? Can I realize my abilities? Have I got good coping skills? Can I manage stress? And can I work productively? Can I make a contribution? Can I feel as though I am part of the community? And so it raises the question then, well, is mental health about distress, or is mental health about thriving? And Keyes in 2000, I think early 2000s at least, resolved that to a certain extent by saying that we can conceptualize our mental health across two continuums. And so there's an illness and distress dimension, and that's the extent to which we have the presence or absence of suffering. So these are the experiences, the psychological experiences that most people want less of. But we can also conceptualize a person's mental health as having a wellness and wellbeing dimension. And these are the experiences, the psychological experiences and interpersonal experiences that people generally want more of. Satisfaction, self-acceptance, coping, belonging, connection, those kinds of things. And so this more accurately captures the nature of people's experiences as far as mental health, meaning you can have individuals who have a diagnosed mental illness, but also have a lot of richness and connection in their life. You can also have individuals who don't have mental illness, don't get picked up by someone like myself through our existing screening measures, but their life is lacking in these positive experiences as well. We want to be able to reach them as much as anyone. And so to invest in one's mental health can mean that we build more of the capacities and psychological experiences that we want. It can also mean that we work to reduce the kinds of experiences that we don't want. Now, for me, where I sit with mental health at the moment, and this is more because I sit in the space, I don't think people necessarily have to carry this level of detail. I conceptualize an individual's mental health based on how they're doing across a range of interrelated but distinct continuums. So the descriptions that you see here are worded from the perspective of what positive functioning on one of those dimensions might look like. But you can imagine that each of these has a negative end as well, where things aren't going so well. And so now assessing one's mental health becomes a nuanced process where we're establishing our state in each of these different areas, our capacity for growth, how they interrelate, and then the context that's happening in our life that might explain how we're doing in these respective areas. And then to work on one's mental health then means activities that are initiated in order to maintain, repair, or grow one of these areas. Now, note that resilience is one of those continuums, one of those domains. So I consider resilience to be a part of mental health. And then if we're using a term like mental well-being, that would probably pick up on a number of these domains, particularly around feelings and mood, particularly around functioning, and particularly around social integration. So the takeaway here is that depending on how deep you dive into the area of mental health, you might need to be more specific about what you mean when you talk about mental health. And I'll talk about how that's been a bit of a challenge for us in terms of our interventions, like what we do. So what have we tried in this space? What have I tried? I prefer the we, because although these things appear on my CV and they appear on my to-do lists, none of these are possible without teams of people, without collaborators and colleagues. And I just realized the other day that I probably need to add a slide to most of my presentations, which is maybe an overly long list, but all the people that are actually involved with and help bring these to life. So in the early days when I started, this is the little E part of E-Mental Health Project Officer, it was really about the digital side of things, digital upgrades. We started a student health and wellbeing blog, for example, that runs to this day. We're over 1,300 posts at this point in time, just publishing regular news and articles on health and wellbeing with a mental health focus. We built websites. This is an example of the website we built for our Wellbeing Community Centre called Oasis. Here, we're just increasing the visibility of what's available. Sanjoli made mention of that in the what can we do. We've built campaigns, built these with students. So Good Vibes Experiment was a student-led campaign. It's been running at Flinders since 2020. It celebrates the different ways that we can build positive mental health. And we did manage to get a Student Experience Network Award in 2022 for that work, which we were pretty stoked about. I'm ready to do Good Vibes Experiment too, but I just need to convince everyone else that you can make the sequel better than the original. We run a range of different programs, therapeutic programs. The one mentioned here is called the Be Well Plan. It was built by a team out of South Australia called Be Well Co. It shows people how to self-assess their mental health and then pick evidence-based activities that support their mental health. It's one of a number of programs that we have available to students. I engage in lectures and teaching. So I do around about 50 presentations a year. They range from 5-minute introductions through to 2-hour workshops. And now an increasing number of my colleagues also do this outreach work as well. So it's not just students coming in to see us and to talk about what's going on for them. It's us heading into the lecture theatres, into the topics and talking about these with the support and encouragement of topic and course coordinators. Some topic and course coordinators really like us, so then often we do some custom work for them. We've developed custom curriculum that often tries to combine something that they're learning within their degree with a kind of a mental health or wellbeing focus. And so an example here is the Positive Shifts program. I was just meeting with my collaborator on this today. It focuses on behaviour change as a key driver of health and mental health, teaches you how to support behaviour change, and it's oriented towards those students who are training to be health professionals, to build up their behaviour change toolkit. So a really nice example of where there's both a mental health narrative, but also a professional skill narrative as well. And a lot of students are telling us that if it's not in their curriculum at the moment, they don't necessarily have a lot of bandwidth to do additional stuff alongside. So the importance of getting into curriculum, which seems to be becoming more important over time. And finally, we're doing some branding at the moment. So Flinders is developing a sub-brand built around wellbeing and mental health, really making it a pillar of what we do here at Flinders. That work is being overseen by a wellbeing working group that kicked off in 2022 and is looking at the university as a whole and what we do to support student mental health and wellbeing. So look, all of these things, as far as I'm concerned, are going really well, or at least that's what I tell people if they ask me. I think at the moment, this is a really energetic and innovative space to sit in. There's strong buy-in from students and staff on the importance of the topic, but there are some challenges. One is that we've been really focused on individuals, which relies on the individual having the motivation and engagement to make that change. But both students and staff are reporting to us that their bandwidth is hugely limited at the moment, and the capacity to take on new ideas and engage in significant change in their behaviour for their mental health, whilst they recognise the value, they're feeling really overwhelmed in terms of mental health becoming another thing on their list that they need to do. And most of these initiatives will only work if it's both students and staff working together, and the bandwidth of both groups is limited at the moment. I was in a lecture the other day where I used that term bandwidth, and it was quickly picked up within the group as people describing, yeah, like I'm at 100%. And if you try and add new information or content into what I'm doing at the moment, even if I perceive it to be valuable, I may not be able to make room for it. I think we've not been quite precise enough about what it is that we're addressing. The reason I sort of deep dive the concept of mental health was that it wasn't actually until a few years into this role that I really started asking myself, what do I actually mean when I use the term? I'm going around the university talking about mental health, and I have a superficial understanding or definition of that. And I think many of our programs and stuff have been launched with just only a very basic idea of what it is that we hope to shift. And I think we're going to need to be much more specific about that moving forward. That kind of capacity to match the intervention to the specific thing we're trying to change has also meant that we have a paucity of evaluation in terms of what we've done. We know what is well received, but we don't necessarily know what is working. There's a bounty of activities happening at Flinders. I always say that Flinders has a fully stocked pantry, but no one's got a decent recipe book. It's like no one knows how to put exactly all of those ingredients together. And so that strategy, what are you trying to do with mental health across the university, hasn't been there, although it is changing. And we also have actually a relatively limited base. I remember a UK site publishing a report talking about student mental health, and the only thing that it gave as a grade in terms of our evidence base was counselling. A lot of the other programs don't necessarily have the support behind them to suggest that they are that they produce the outcomes that we want them to. And so I think not only is evidence-based limited, but those of us working in the space, and I do come from an academic background, probably need to be publishing more on what it is that we're doing to improve that evidence base over time. So look, a couple of these are subject to certainly current initiatives. We are trying to solve the evaluation issue. We are trying to solve the strategic direction issue. But others of these remain a challenge. Now, for me, moving forward, there's kind of 4 things that I think are really on my mind in terms of expanding how I think about mental health, how I think about intervening to change mental health. And they've come about because of inspiration from different sources. So from the Blue Zones work, I'm happy to take questions on that. From the Blue Zones work, I've been inspired to sort of shift that perspective from thinking about self-care as an individual to thinking about community care. How do you build communities there where each individual is just naturally nudged and supported towards making healthy choices and decisions? I've been really heavily influenced by the social emotional wellbeing model of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander philosophy around mental health and wellbeing, thinking about the foundation of mental health and the foundation of a robust sense of self, and trying to kind of work out whether or not we can build on a basis of connections and caretaking versus what I think is a basis of competition that sort of sits underneath how universities and the broader culture operates. I'm super interested in working out whether you can create functioning and effective digital communities, because I really don't want campus to be a barrier to what we have moving forward. Flinders is expanding as a university, and that means we have students at many different campuses now, and I don't want those to become necessarily individual silos, or for at least there to be some connective tissue between them. And so digital is the avenue through which I think we can do that. But I've also not seen lots of particularly great examples of how to do that. So if you have one, please get in contact with me. And then finally, within my own field of psychology, I guess I've based a lot of my current teaching on a cognitive behavioral conceptualization of mental health. So I tend to place very high importance on intentional decisions and choices and actions that people take. But I'm interested in integrating models of therapy that actually dig further into the subconscious. I think they provide some really interesting insights into why people do what they do. They were not a key part of my training, but they are certainly a key part of my ongoing learning. So look, that's where I've been, where we're headed, what we're doing, what we're working on. If any of that is of interest to you, I know this has just been a flyover at this point in time. Please feel free to get in contact with me if you'd like to learn more. If you have a solution to something that we've been talking about, if you think I've got something wrong and you've got a nice corrective source to draw from, I'd be very happy to hear from anyone. And again, my thanks to Epigeum for the opportunity to speak, and again to Sanjoli, because I think the two presentations are different enough to cover more of the mental health landscape than each individual one would on its own. So I was really excited to be able to share a stage today. So thank you for all of you who have attended as well. I know you've got busy schedules and many other community demands, but that you're here means a lot.
Thanks, Gareth. That was really interesting. Great to see all those different initiatives that are going on at Flinders. And everyone, please do put any questions that you have for Gareth or Sanjoli into the chat, because they will both be able to help answering them. So please do go ahead if anything's made you think, or you've got a question, or you want to know what they think about different ideas. Just put your question in there. I do have some questions for both of you. And one of them relates to, I guess you both touched on this in terms of there are supports available. There are all different types of students attending universities. That's something Sanjoli sort of talked a lot about. But so with all of these supports available and with all the different types of students and the different study modes, how can universities better reach students to inform them of what's available, and including those from some of the more underrepresented groups or those that might not come on campus? So what's effective, or what could be done more of? How do students find that information? Maybe I'll start with Gareth, if that's okay.
Sure. Excellent question. In the early days, we approached that by just trying to hit as many communication channels as we could: email, social media, text message, posters, flyers, whatever. I think I feel as though we've reached saturation there. There's such an overwhelm of information via those channels that I don't think we get a lot of additional benefit from it. The outreach work into topics seems to be at least a preliminary good step for us there. You get a face that's familiar. So I've met Gareth now. He's at the counselling service. I can contact him if I've got a question. I've met Bob. I've met various members of the team. There's now a face to the name. There's a face to the service. They seemed nice. They talked about stuff that was relevant. And so probably one of the big ones for us is the outreach side of things. And then the second one would be opportunities to that range anywhere from volunteering, so students that work at the community centre, through to the co-design stuff, so students that we're actually building stuff with. Those students become excellent ambassadors. If they're happy with the process, if they're happy with the volunteering and they're happy with the co-design, they become ambassadors, and then they talk to their student and peer cohorts and facilitate a lot of that. So that's two that sort of stand out for us at the moment.
Thanks, Gareth. And I can see Sanjoli nodding there. And I was going to ask you the same question, because you did sort of you did mention that, you know, there are some students that don't know about what's there, despite this sort of trying to make sure the information's out there. Is there anything more you can add to what Gareth's already said?
Absolutely, Lucy. I think that's a very relevant question, and I totally agree with Dr. Garrett there. I think we've reached that saturation there in terms of utilizing communications to reach students. So probably what I suggest is, when orientation sessions are done, usually that is a good time to kind of reach out to students, whether through in-person orientation, or there could be certain, I don't know, different universities do different things, but through our orientation booklets and stuff, a mention of what support services are available. And also, I think that our faculty can be a good touch point for students, because a lot of times most of the students tend to reach out to their professors for any kind of support. And if professors or like the academic staff identifies that there might be some support that the student might need, so they could plug in the student with the support team. So that is another thing. And I absolutely agree with Dr. Gareth. I think if students are roped in as student ambassadors, that word of mouth definitely spreads, and they actually get more students kind of access that service. So yeah.
Great, thank you so much, Sanjoli and Gareth. And then my next question is a bit about the bandwidth side of things that Gareth mentioned. How, with all of this outreach, people know that support might be there, but they feel like they don't have the bandwidth to do whatever spiritual healing practices, or go to counseling, or do the mental health, wellness activities. What would you say to that? How can you encourage people that it's worth making room for mental health, or communicate about that side of things? Sanjoli, maybe we'll start with you.
Sure, Lucy. I think just letting students know that there is support available is enough. We might not necessarily kind of impose it on them, or try to rope them in forcefully. We don't need coercion there. I think if students are aware, oh, this is the helpline number that's available, so if I'm feeling too intense about something, or having certain suicidal thoughts, this is where I reach out. So I think that information in itself is enough. And I think usually in mental health conditions, and I'm speaking this from my personal experience as well, a person takes their own time to kind of seek help, and that shouldn't be seen as a problem necessarily. So yeah, once a student knows that there is a system that's there, that's accessible, that's approachable, that's affordable, I think we've done a job well. So that is how I look at it. Yeah. And also, I think, sorry, another quick point that I'd like to add is, I've often observed that there are, gaps. Again, when I talked about working in silos, I've observed that we don't spread or like share information, between different parties. I understand, the concerns of confidentiality and privacy there, but taking consent from student, and basically avoiding a situation where student has to repeat and go through their entire mental health condition, go into that dark space again and talk about the trauma. Instead of that, that information should be shared. If, for instance, a student has approached a professor with all of this information, these notes should be shared with the next party instead of the student. So information sharing, I think, can really help, because that is one barrier that I've seen that stops students or prevents students from taking help, because they feel they have to go through the entire thing over and over again. Yeah, thank you. I hope that makes sense.
Thanks, Anjali. That's great. And Gareth, what do you think about the kind of question around making room for mental health? Sanjoli said, you need to know it's there, but it's up to the students perhaps to then take advantage of it. What would you say to that? Does it need to be more proactive, or is it fine as it is? Or
look, I I am of the view that if any individual wants to significantly alter something in their life, that it's likely to require some kind of significant behavior change of some sort. You know, if I want to get significantly fitter than I am now, it's going to require me to really change my allocation of time to exercise and nutrition and a bunch of things. And so there is this reality that, yes, you will actually have to find room for or prioritize it in your life. How we try to manage that in our teaching, though, is that the starting point for that can often be very simple. You don't have to drop straight into therapy 3 times a week, you know, or an hour of meditation a day. The low intensity psychological intervention literature tells us that people can get meaningful impacts, positive impacts from quite low intensity interventions. And once they can see the connection between I made this choice and something about my mental health is improved, then they generally have more motivation to work out how to find it in their lives. So teaching wise, I try to say, look, these are the change areas that are going to be important, but your entry point into that isn't necessarily super hard. If anyone's come across BJ Fogg's work on tiny habits, you know, he talks about at the core of that idea is that really significant changes to one's life start sometimes with almost these ludicrously small shifts. And he really encourages people to invest the time and effort in finding what those little initial shifts are, knowing that there's a snowball effect that occurs once someone locks into something that's resonating. And so that's how we're tackling it at the moment. And but I think that topic that's one that I'll change at some point. Not that I think what I've said is wrong, but there'll be other parts of that story and narrative that I can't quite work out yet. And they are more cultural. They're more to do with an underlying kind of hustle competitive culture that only sees your worth related to how many particular activities you can pump into a particular period of time, right? And that's from my perspective at the moment, a battle no individual is going to be able to win because they constantly have to be growing or improving. And so there's some shift in the overall narrative that's less about competition and more about caretaking. What does it mean to be a caretaker of my health and well-being? What does it mean to be a caretaker of other people's health and well-being? That I think can hopefully mean we can do a lot of that work in a far more relaxed and rewarding way. But I'm really just at the beginning of trying to work out how to articulate that. So if it was clumsy, then that's why.
Thanks so much, Gareth. That's a really positive message that doesn't have to be a big thing that you start with. It can be something small, and that's a good takeaway. I've got time for one more quick question. So just a really quick answer to this one. And it's another big question, but what do you think the future of mental health support for university students will or should look like? So if you can just in a nutshell, maybe try and answer that one. Not a big ask. Gareth, would you like to go first on that?
What a corker of a last question. I'll be honest and say I don't exactly know. I think we have most of the activities, but I would say that our evidence base at this point in time probably isn't sufficient for someone to call kind of like this is what it should look like. What I think is important is that it picks up a number of things that I think came through more in Sanjoli's presentation, is that it recognises the diversity of people who are in that community, and that's part of it, and it's co-designed. So the ultimate solution should not just come from Gareth or similar to Gareth's head and be imposed on everyone. It should have been built with the relative people involved. So that's less about what it should look like, but at least a couple of the processes that should be in place in order to move towards whatever it looks like. I hope that's not too evasive.
No, that's great. It's kind of like paving the way, how to pave the way for the future of mental health support. So that's fantastic. What about you, Sanjoli? Would you have any thoughts on what the future of mental health support for university students should look like or could look like?
Again, reiterating what Dr. Gareth said, it's hard to predict. I hope there's not another pandemic that hits the world, and I hope climate change doesn't, kind of devastate the earth. But just remaining hopeful, and I think it's a very idealistic situation. I would like to be very hopeful about the future of mental health. I think. A lot of stakeholders are being very active, and there's more discussion, at least relative to the past. We're talking about mental health more actively now, so I hope there's a positive change in the future. But yeah, again, I think we need to take everyone along. That's the only kind of message that I want to leave everyone with today with, that we need to take everyone along. We don't have to leave anyone behind, and I think when the last person is also included in the discussion, that's when we have a positive mental health policy or approach. So yeah, I hope that happens in the future.
That's great. That's great. And I hope so too. And that's all we have time for today. But thank you so much, Gareth and Sanjoli, for being here today. It's been fantastic watching both of your presentations and hearing some of your answers to the questions around student wellbeing. So thank you again, everyone, for joining today. And I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of the day. Thanks, everyone.